suggested in terms of some communication from the commission to the back and forth with the planning zone. I think that's a good idea. I'd like to say that I agree very strongly that the suite of LD, land development regulations, zoning, planning, all that stuff, codes should be as clear as possible, as consistent as possible. I think there's a strong feeling among all of us here that we want it clear. That said, I think there's also a very strong feeling that that body of information that collects what the city projects out to potential investors and developers needs to very much capture what the community wants our community to look like. And that's a very important step. And with that, I would echo what you said. Maybe we're not in a huge rush. It's more important to do the job right and make sure that we do send a clear message and one that we all stand behind, such that when this message goes out to developers, they build something, they don't come back and say, hey, what are all these people who are unhappy about this? That we've thought of that and built that into whatever it is that's in the code is something that there's strong support in the community. I think is very important.
Pam, is there something wrong with the microphones? Because I hear all of the microphones.
It's a little echoey. It's
very reverberating and it's madness.
Yes.
Can you lower it a little bit, possibly? Okay, I'm sorry. It's just very distracting. Commissioner Zerni?
You really want me to hang around with you guys?
I think we only have one more meeting, but it probably would be a good thing.
If everybody up here is inclined to, okay with that, I'm fine with that. I just wanted to mention that these codes, I think, are becoming more form-based. There's a kind of graphic information that needs to go along with the written. We have a situation coming before us that needs to be resolved, and I think some of that has to do with the clarity that you all are mentioning here. So one of the things I think would be important for us is to have as much of a pictorial component as well as the written. And in that regard, that gives people some guidelines. I know that the most challenging part is the way the historic districts and the non-historic districts work. And I think now they're being more separated because of the big boards. And I think that we could come to a much clearer understanding of these things and understand what compatibility is, and how we go about what's aesthetically appropriate, those kind of things that are really challenging to put our fingers on. So I would welcome the opportunity to be a liaison.
The only thing I have concern over is that we talked about maybe discussing as a commission, having our boards and advisory boards have representation bigger than the current representation. We were going to have a meeting on that to see if we could do that in the new year, I know. But does that conflict, city manager? I know we were talking about having city commissioners oversee different boards.
We've talked about that kind of activity. It's not specifically, I don't believe, the advisory boards and things that's listed in your code, in this case the P&Z and the HRB. You kind of cross a line and take into account when Mr. Rinaldi, his point is well made. You run a risk when you have a policy board that's going to be making the final decision, stepping over and getting more involved in an advisory board business. That's something I would,
more or less just to listen.
Which is different than going to the Chamber of Commerce or
right.
The other entities and being a representative of the city.
If
that's what you're asking, yeah. To kind of ask the question, if you're going to sit on all the advisory boards, why have the advisory boards? Did they function and perform sort of independently in making their recommendation and asking their questions? Sometimes an advisory board can be impeded or steered, or there's a lot of things that can be accused or not because you had one of the decision makers, possible members involved in
that
what
was
they're
my
doing.
concern.
Yeah, so you might want to keep that separation in mind as you consider that idea.
Yeah, I think it was just an offer of listening. That's all.
I agree.
Yeah,
I don't
you
have
can do that now.
I know that we can.
You can go and sit in the back of the room and listen to your heart's content. But
Commissioner Amoroso?
But we also had discussions about having some kind of workshops or directional meetings so we could actually give somewhat direction to different boards. and that hasn't happened yet.
Or another tri-board meeting.
Well, when you're dealing with drafting statutes, the way I look at it, I can hand you a whole bunch of paper and tell you to read it. And if you want to read this stuff, it's pretty boring and it's pretty abstract because we're particularly looking at words that are describing whatever, but you don't have a picture of it. So I think it's clear that we want the staff to give us more of a picture. But one of the aspects that we might want to ask staff to do is more of a flow chart in which you basically analyze in the flow chart the role of what each individual or each board, each group is going to be doing in any typical decision-making process that's going to happen. Once you have that flow chart in front of you, then when you see the actual words of the statute, you can key it into this is what's going to happen here, because you have different functions of what these laws are going to do. At some point you're doing legislative work, at some point you're doing quasi-judicial work, at some point you're doing administrative work. Well, where do they all key in, and who's going to do what? So when they just hand you 200 pages of law, it's up to you to figure all that out. But I think I don't really know what my role is as a board member to instruct staff that maybe a flow chart would be the way to go.
City manager?
That's an advisory board. That's your job. You just did it.
Yeah. So that's something we want to do.
And no, I agree with all of that. I just concerned that having individual commissioners, being that we all one different voice. Together we are one voice that could give you direction. But
Well, it's not that we're looking for direction, is that if the board is heading down a certain road, if the board is heading down a certain road because we're reading the statute is going this way, and for example, that commissioner thinks we're heading in the wrong direction, that commissioner can then come back to a regular commission meeting and say, I think we need to intercede with the planning and zoning board on this issue, and here's the way they're going, and maybe we don't want them to. I don't think that's a real issue right now, but I would hate us wasting time, and then because you don't have enough time as it is. So
What do you mean?
yeah, if somebody is sitting there and thinks that we're heading down the wrong road, or even we get the impression that that things are going correctly, that's good. But they can report back to you at the next commission meeting. I attended, here's what I heard, I just want to let you know, this is the road we're going down. If anybody has any objections, maybe it's a good time to call the board in and have a workshop, whatever you want to do. Or you could just wait till you hear from everybody and then say, gee, I don't like it, or gee, I like it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just pulling you in a little bit before we make decisions that maybe you didn't want to do. We think we know what you want, but in case we don't, that's the only reason to have somebody there.
No, I see pros and cons of both of them, to be quite honest with you. And from the city attorney's standpoint, I'd want to find out from the city attorney.
Manager had a good